Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. This is the third issue on Boyd's monumental work, The Crucifixion of the Warrior God, and I'll begin to interact with the book itself. In the first 6 out of 24 chapters, Boyd gives us his general theory of interpretation, or in one word, his hermeneutic. Before I dive into this, however, I need to vent a major frustration I have with this book. Boyd does not give us a definition of violence. In an academic book, I find this a serious and incomprehensible omission. It's also infuriating. Boyd claims, in a footnote about this, that everyone seems to know violence when they see it, but this is ludicrous. In the same footnote, Boyd also argues that violence is hard to define and there is no consensus among scholars. This is precisely why it needs discussion. At the very least, he should have offered his readers a working definition, however rough, that gives us some idea of his boundaries around the concept. To be sure, this omission in itself does not invalidate his argument, it just makes it hard to read. I'm still wondering if Boyd would accept a distinction between violence and force or not, and if yes, what the distinction would be. If a police officer uses a gun to stop a criminal, to use a banal example, is that violence? Is it legitimate? What if a parent uses physical force to prevent a child from running out into the road? An illustration that violence or force and love are not necessarily always mutually exclusive. And what about verbal violence and verbal abuse? Is this included? About 1/4 into the book, I'm still unsure. In spite of this lack, I was positively surprised by Boyd's general hermeneutical foundation. This first part of the book was a great read. Boyd argues for interpretation that is both Christ-centered and cross-centered. Jesus and the New Testament are not an addition to earlier revelation, something that stands alongside the earlier parts. Jesus is not merely a better or greater revelation. He transcends and outshines previous revelation. As a result, we can only truly understand the old in the light of the new, that is, Jesus. Boyd also argues that it is precisely on the cross that this superior revelation finds its center and shines most brightly. Everything Jesus is and does, and everything that God is and does, is related to the cross. This too needs to guide and shape our interpretation of previous revelation. It means that everything God says and does in the Old Testament must also be related to Christ and the cross, pointing forward to Him, as pointed out by Jesus himself in Luke 24. This is how we know what God is like, who He truly is. A different word that can be used to speak of God's nature is, of course, love. Often the Greek word agape is used to make clear this love is utterly unique and supreme because it seeks nothing for itself. This is the essence of God, and on the cross we get to see what this means. This is how far God is willing to go. The cross is the highest expression of love. For this reason, Boyd adopts the term Cruciform for his approach to interpretation and indeed for his whole understanding of the Old Testament. The cross should be the center of all Christian theology and of all our interpretation of Scripture. Point well taken, even if there's also a few things in these chapters I find unpersuasive or questionable. I have my doubts, for instance, about Boyd's strong and continuous critique of the 5th century Church Father Augustine, or Constantine, the 4th century emperor who embraced Christianity. But this does not belong to the essence of Boyd's argument. A second example of a questionable claim in the book, Jesus blatantly contradicted and overturned multiple Old Testament passages and principles. So Boyd. I think this completely fails to do justice to the rich and nuanced relationship between Old and New, between type and fulfillment. Notice that in Matthew 5, Jesus explicitly denies doing what Boyd claims he did. Later in this chapter, Boyd admits as much, but in doing this, he contradicts himself. To fulfill, or perfect and complete, and to take something to its true meaning and purpose, is different from to revoke or overturn. Still, so far this is pretty good. But it is also nothing new. This shows in the massive array of quotations from many other writers and theologians in these chapters. This includes Martin Luther, who rediscovered the centrality of the cross and gave it a central place in his theology more than 500 years ago. On one point, however, Boyd may indeed be on to something new. He points out that no one, at least no theologian, has applied this hermeneutic to those passages in the Old Testament that appear to associate God with violence. Surely such passages stand in tension with, Boyd might prefer, contradict the New Testament revelation of God's unconditional love and self-sacrifice through the cross. Surely there is a need for a consistent and systematic application of a cruciform hermeneutic to such passages. How do they relate to Christ and the cross? How do they point forward to him? Well, these are good questions, and it may indeed be that no theologian has produced such a study. However, I do think that many of the faithful already read Boyd's problem passages in a cruciform or Christ-centered way. I've benefited greatly, for instance, from reading and studying Joshua and Judges, to name two of the more violent books in the Bible. I have never been inclined to apply them in any violent way. Almost automatically, and perhaps unwittingly, most of us read such books through the lens of the New Testament. We know our war is not against flesh and blood. We know we are involved in a spiritual, not a physical war. We know Jesus taught us to love and forgive and bless our enemies. We know that we conquer, a military term, through the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, utterly non-violent means. We may not have an answer for every hard passage in the Old Testament, but we are reading the Old Testament in the light of Jesus. Which means, if this is true for you, you may be ahead of the scholars. I should point out that Boyd has a specific take on what a cruciform hermeneutic means. To him, cruciform implies non-violent, self-sacrificial, enemy-embracing, unconditional, indiscriminately loving, other-oriented. Throughout the book, some combination of these terms, in connection with either God or his love, appears numerous times, almost like a mantra, and it obviously summarizes Boyd's understanding of what cruciform means. This raises some questions. Most importantly, is God entirely, essentially, and always non-violent, as Boyd believes? Of course, at this point, it is most unfortunate that violence has not been defined, but this much is clear. Boyd is a pacifist. He argues that Christians should never resort to violence, that this is what Jesus taught us and practiced himself, and that the early church, up until Constantine, early 4th century, practiced non-violence, including the rejection of military service for Christians. By the way, that the entire early church was pacifist is denied by Boyd's critics, and it seems to me that the claim simply isn't true. But should Christians be pacifists? Well, I'm not convinced by Boyd's arguments. That God in Jesus refuses to use violence on the cross and during his earthly ministry does not mean he will never resort to force. This simply doesn't follow. The standard set by Jesus certainly changes much, including the way believers make war. Violence is not the way of the kingdom, unlike that of empire. The way of the cross is that of forgiveness and love for enemies. But does this mean that the use of force in a fallen world is always wrong? Boyd's non-violence is a vital presupposition of the entire book. Take it out and his case begins to break down. To the extent that we believe God may use coercive force, whether in the past, the present, or the future, Boyd's diatribe against the violent portrayals of God and his search for a radical solution loses much of its force. In that case, God may well have compromised in the past. He certainly did this with many commandments in the Old Testament law that obviously fall short of his real standard, compromised by going along with human violence. War and violence are obviously not God's ideal, and he will put an end to them eventually. But what if a violent act is the lesser evil? That God is a warrior is, to Boyd, a distorted portrayal of God, who in his essence is wholly non-violent. For a pacifist, the image of warrior or war cannot be positive. But in the Bible, the image is positive. The warrior David becomes a type of the Messiah. It will undergo substantial redefinition in the progression of Revelation. But God did reveal himself as a warrior. To a people familiar with war and warfare, he did work with David as a warlord, a military leader. When David wrote, "He trains my hands for war," Psalm 18, he wasn't misrepresenting God. He was speaking from personal experience. God went along. War, like violence, is undesirable, but there is no quick fix. Throughout Scripture and history, God gradually opens up alternatives and introduces a vision for a very different world. He also enables a redefinition of who the enemy is and of who are the objects of his love and compassion. For the fierceness with which he pursues this love and compassion, warrior is a fitting image. None of this means that God has never used violence in the sense of coercive force in the past and will never use violence in the future. A true cruciform hermeneutic, while critical of human violence, which rarely serves justice, does not need a presupposition of absolute nonviolence. Okay, in upcoming issues, I will further look at how Boyd develops this approach in more detail and how he reinterprets Bible passages he deems violent portrayals that distort who God truly is. But for now, I will close with this thought on violence in the New Testament that I find more persuasive than Boyd's absolute and unconditional nonviolence. Quote, "Even when Jesus forbids the sword as a means to advance the kingdom, the New Testament cannot be said to teach absolute pacifism, nor does it forbid the Christian from bearing the sword in the service of society and the greater good of others, even when this was the practice of some, but only of some, in the early church."
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.